No one should freeze on Christmas. Elena murmured the words, almost semi-consciously, as she placed the steaming bowl of soup in front of the trembling man. Her hands steady, despite the cold that seeped in every time the diner door hesitated to close. The warmth rising from the bowl drifted between them like a fragile promise, fighting the winter wind, pressing against the frosted windows. She noticed how his shoulders curled inward, as if trying to guard the last spark of heat in his body. And while the world outside raged in icy silence, something in her heart insisted this was the moment she could not turn away from, even if it cost her more than she could afford. He lifted his gaze slowly, his eyes holding the hollow exhaustion of someone who had spent too long unseen by the world, and Elena felt the weight of that look settle deep within her. His soaked jacket clung to him like a second skin, rainwater still dripping onto the vinyl seat beneath him. Each breath he took wavered, fragile and uneven, revealing hours spent wandering in the storm with nowhere safe to land. The bruised tremor in his voice suggested a man who had been fighting his battles alone for far too long. And in that single glance exchanged between them, Elena sensed a quiet plea he was too proud or too broken to voice. She knew exactly what giving him that meal meant, though. It meant handing away the last $15 she had tucked into her apron, the money she needed for groceries and the bus ride back to her tiny apartment. She hesitated only for the length of one heartbeat, and then that hesitation dissolved beneath the weight of her own empathy. She had been hungry before, had been cold before, had been tired enough to cry silently on the late bus home, and she knew too well how a small kindness could feel like salvation. So she chose him over her fear. Because sometimes, she thought, survival isn't just about food and shelter, but about remembering that human warmth still exists somewhere. The diner, usually a cozy refuge on winter nights, felt unusually quiet as she stepped back from the table. Only a few customers lingered, hunched over coffee cups, watching the snow pile against the windows. The glow of holiday lights reflected off the glass in delicate streaks, filling the room with a gentle, melancholy shimmer. A soft hum played from a distant radio, crooning a Christmas melody that seemed far too hopeful for the heaviness sitting in Elena's chest. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and tried to breathe, though the cold, the hunger, and the uncertainty pressed against her ribs with familiar insistence. And even then, she whispered to herself that she had done the right thing. But the moment of quiet didn't last. Peter, the manager, stepped out from behind the counter carrying the tension of someone who considered empathy a flawed business strategy. His footsteps were sharp, impatient, echoing across the linoleum floor as he approached her. Elena saw his jaw tighten long before he spoke, and she felt the air around her shrink, folding into that tightness that always came before humiliation. She tried to brace herself, hoping he might lower his voice for once, but Peter Holman didn't believe in soft edges. "What do you think you're doing, Elena?" he snapped, loud enough for every head in the diner to lift. His gaze darted toward the stranger's steaming bowl, then back to her, his irritation rising with each passing second. He didn't see a freezing man in need. He saw a loss on the balance sheet. She tried to explain that it was Christmas, that the man was freezing, that kindness was worth something. But Peter waved her words away before they even reached him. And in the tension that followed, she felt her stomach sink with that familiar blend of shame and defiance. The stranger tried to speak up, his voice cracking as he attempted to defend her, but the cold had nearly stolen his words. His hands trembled on the edge of the table, and Elena instinctively placed her hand over his to steady him. Peter scoffed at the gesture, dismissing both of them with a look that stripped away whatever dignity the stranger still held. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but she refused to pull her hand back. Not tonight. Not on Christmas Eve. Not when this man needed a moment of humanity more than she needed approval. Peter finally walked away, shaking his head, muttering something about charity cases and employees who don't understand real responsibility. Eleanor stood still long after he disappeared into the back office, letting the humiliation settle like frost across her skin. The customers avoided her eyes, some out of discomfort, some out of pity, none willing to intervene. She took a slow breath, grounding herself in the steady warmth of the soup she had given away, and in that breath she made peace with the consequences. She would not regret the kindness. The stranger managed a soft, broken "thank you," but the words carried far more weight than their simplicity suggested. Eleanor smiled gently, urging him to eat before the soup cooled, and for a brief moment the diner felt warm again. She watched him lift the spoon with shaking fingers, watched color slowly return to his face, watched hope flicker behind his weary eyes. And she realized she didn't need gratitude to validate her choice. The healing beginning in his expression was enough. Still, she felt something unspoken in his gaze, something like a secret he carried quietly. Moments later he stood, pulling his thin jacket tighter, and Elena offered him a scarf from the lost and found box. One she pretended not to know actually belonged to her. The man hesitated, but accepted it, bowing his head in quiet appreciation before stepping back into the swirling snow. She watched him disappear into the night until even his silhouette melted into the storm. The door closed behind him, leaving only the whisper of falling snow and the soft echo of her own doubts. And for reasons she couldn't name, she felt as though the night had just shifted, as if something unseen had begun to move. When silence returned to the diner, Eleanor stood alone beside the empty booth, her hands resting lightly on the table where the stranger had sat. The faint warmth rising from the soup bowl lingered in the air like a memory, soft and fleeting. She closed her eyes, letting the exhaustion of the day wash over her, and wondered if kindness always had to cost so much. Yet beneath that worry lay a quiet certainty, the sense that the story of this night wasn't finished. And as she turned away from the window where snow kept falling without mercy, a subtle ache stirred inside her, whispering that the consequences of her choice were only just beginning. The moment the stranger disappeared into the storm, the diner seemed to exhale, leaving Elena in a stillness so heavy it felt almost physical. She stood motionless beside the window, watching the snow swirl beneath the street lamp like drifting shards of broken light. The warmth from the kitchen no longer reached her, and the cold inside felt deeper than the winter pressing against the glass. She wrapped her arms around herself, not out of fear, but out of weariness. Some silences, she thought, speak louder than arguments. When she finally moved, her footsteps were slow, almost hesitant, as though each one carried the weight of Peter's voice echoing in her mind. She reached for the empty bowl the stranger had left behind and held it for a moment, the fading warmth pressing gently into her palms. The scent of the soup lingered faintly, rising like a soft reminder of why she had done what she did. But the memory of Peter's accusation tugged at her confidence with sharp fingers. And in the tension between those two truths, her heart felt pulled in opposite directions. She placed the bowl in the sink and turned on the water, watching steam curl upward as if trying to soften the edges of her doubt. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their cold glow settling across the empty tables in long, pale lines. Christmas decorations hung quietly along the walls, but even their cheerful colors seemed muted tonight. Elena ran the sponge across the ceramic with slow, rhythmic motions, trying to anchor her thoughts before they slipped into worry. Still, the question pressed at her insides. Had she made everything worse for herself? In the reflection on the window above the sink, she caught her own tired eyes staring back. They looked older than she felt, shaped by years of overwork, late nights, and responsibilities she should never have had to carry alone. She pressed her lips together, fighting the rising burn of embarrassment that Peter's words had left behind. She hated how easily he could bruise her confidence, how quickly he could make her feel small. But beneath that ache lived something sturdier, a quiet conviction that kindness had value, even if tonight it cost her more than she could spare. She turned off the tap, letting the last drops fall, and leaned both hands on the counter as the silence stretched around her. Behind her, a few chairs creaked softly as customers gathered their coats and stepped into the storm without a word. No one said thank you. No one said good night. Their absence left the diner feeling like a stage after the curtains fall, empty and echoing with unspoken judgments. Elena drew a slow breath, trying to steady the trembling inside her chest. Tonight, even her resilience felt thin. When the door chimed one last time and the final customer slipped out, the hush that followed carried a sting she wasn't ready for. She walked to the tables, collecting napkins and cups left behind, her fingers brushing crumbs as though gathering pieces of a day that had fractured in too many places. Every scrape of a chair and every sigh of wind outside fed the quiet growing inside her. She paused once, closing her eyes and letting exhaustion settle onto her shoulders like a second coat. The loneliness of the moment pressed in from all sides. As she wiped the last table, her thoughts drifted back to the man she had fed. The tremor in his hands, the sorrow in his eyes, the gratitude so heavy it seemed to bow his entire spirit. She wondered where he had gone, whether he had found shelter, whether the scarf she'd given him was enough. The city was merciless in winter, especially on those who walked it with no home to claim. A sudden shiver traveled through her, colder than the wind could ever be. The world was full of people fighting invisible battles, and she had seen one unfold right in front of her tonight. She returned to the counter and checked her apron pocket, almost out of habit, though she knew what she would find. Nothing but a folded bus schedule and a few loose coins. The absence of the $15 pressed against her chest with quiet finality. That money had been her last bit of safety before payday, her fragile buffer against hunger and late fees. She swallowed hard, feeling the pinch of fear slip beneath her ribs. Tomorrow would be harder now. And yet, despite that fear, she couldn't bring herself to regret the choice she'd made. When she finally reached to turn off the lights, the diner darkened slowly, one section at a time, as though falling asleep after a long, weary shift. Only the small Christmas tree in the corner remained lit, its soft amber glow flickering across the floor. Elena paused, watching the lights blink gently, their warmth spreading into the dimness like a quiet reassurance. She let herself stand there a moment longer, breathing in the faint scent of pine and coffee, grounding herself in the stillness. The night was cold, but this small glow reminded her that warmth existed somewhere. As she stepped toward the back door to leave, a final thought brushed against her mind, uninvited yet persistent. The uneasy sense that the night wasn't finished with her yet. Something in the air felt suspended, as though the world had taken a breath, but refused to release it. She pulled her coat tighter and pushed open the door, the snow-laden wind greeting her in a sharp, swirling rush. And as she stepped into the lonely winter night, a subtle ache settled in her chest, whispering that the consequences of her kindness were only beginning to unfold. Elena reached her small apartment just past midnight, the hallway dim and quiet, its flickering light bulb casting long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, letting the warmth soak slowly into her chilled bones. The silence of home wrapped around her like a thin blanket, comforting but not quite enough to ease the day's weight. She set her bag on the chair and slipped off her shoes, her toes aching from hours on her feet, and for a breath, she allowed herself to simply stand still. The apartment smelled faintly of cinnamon tea and old books, scents that had lingered long after she'd stopped having time to enjoy either. A soft lamp illuminated the space, A tiny living room, a kitchenette barely bigger than a closet, and a bed tucked into the corner like an afterthought. It wasn't much, but it had once felt like refuge. Tonight, though, it felt like a reminder of everything she'd been holding together with threadbare hope. She walked to the window and brushed aside the curtain to watch the snowfall. The flakes drifted silently, indifferent to the struggles unfolding beneath them. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she reached for it, half hoping it was her grandmother's nightly message. Instead, it was a notification from her bank. Another automatic payment had gone through, leaving her balance thin and fragile. She locked the screen quickly, unwilling to stare at numbers that reflected more fear than stability. Still, she smiled softly as she imagined her grandmother knitting by the fireplace, humming old Christmas melodies. Those memories had carried her through so many long nights. They still did. She poured herself a cup of water and sat on the edge of the bed, letting the mattress sink beneath her. Images from earlier that evening surfaced: the trembling man, the steam rising from the soup, Peter's harsh words slicing through the moment. She pressed her thumb to the bridge of her nose, feeling tension bloom between her eyes. Kindness shouldn't hurt this much, she thought. Yet she knew that if she were placed in the same moment again, she would make the same decision without hesitation. Some instincts lived deeper than fear. For a moment, she allowed her mind to wander back to the life she once imagined for herself. A life where holidays weren't spent working double shifts, where bills didn't tighten their grip around her every month, where joy didn't feel like a luxury she had to earn. She remembered being younger, dreaming of studying culinary arts, of opening her own cafe filled with warmth and music. Time had a way of reshaping dreams into necessities, of trading passion for survival. And yet, the dream still flickered somewhere inside her. She stood and walked to the counter, picking up a small framed photo of her and her grandmother from years ago. Their smiles were wide, their eyes bright with the simplicity of better days. She traced a finger across the glass, feeling both tenderness and longing. Her grandmother had taught her that generosity mattered most when it cost something. That real kindness wasn't meant to be convenient, and Eleanor held on to that wisdom like a compass, even when it led her through storms like the one outside now. The wind howled against the window, rattling the frame, and Elena drew her sweater closer around her shoulders. She sat at the tiny kitchen table and opened her notebook, pages filled with recipes, scribbled between grocery lists and reminders. She flipped through them slowly, letting each idea bring a small warmth to her spirit. Food had always been her love language, her quiet way of giving light to others when her own world grew dim. The thought brought a small, peaceful smile to her lips. But as she continued turning the pages, something shifted in the air. The apartment suddenly felt too still, too expectant, as if holding a breath. She paused, her fingers resting on the page where she'd once written her dream cafe menu in careful handwriting. For a moment, the weight of everything she'd lost, or never had the chance to reach for, pressed against her chest. She closed her eyes, letting the ache settle. And then, as though summoned by that fragile vulnerability, a sound cut through the stillness. A sharp knock echoed from the front door, loud enough to make her flinch. Her eyes flew open, her heart leaping painfully against her ribs. Midnight visitors were not part of her life. She froze, listening, wondering if exhaustion had tricked her. But then it came again, 3 firm knocks, each one more insistent than the last. The apartment fell into a heavy, breathless silence as she stood slowly, her pulse thrumming in her ears. With her hand hovering over the doorknob, she hesitated, sensing something significant waiting on the other side, something that did not belong to the quiet life she had tried so hard to maintain. For the first time that night, fear slipped into her thoughts, sharp and cold, And as the storm howled outside, Elena realized that whatever waited beyond that door would change everything she thought she understood about her future. And then the knocking stopped, leaving only a silence far more unsettling than the sound itself. The silence after the final knock stretched through the apartment like a held breath. But when Elena finally opened the door, the hallway was empty except for a folded notice lying on the floor. She bent down slowly, her fingers trembling as she picked it up, already sensing trouble before she unfolded the paper. The harsh red letters confirmed what her heart feared, an overdue rent warning, stamped with a deadline she could no longer meet. The words blurred slightly as exhaustion pressed behind her eyes, and in that instant, the quiet dignity she carried felt dangerously thin. She pressed the door shut gently, trying to contain the rising panic that threatened to break through her composure. The apartment seemed smaller now, as though the walls leaned inward with the weight of the eviction notice. She placed it on the table, smoothing the paper with careful hands, as if tidiness could soften its reality. Her breath came slowly, each inhale a negotiation with her own fear. Christmas Eve was meant to hold miracles, she thought, yet tonight it held warnings. When morning arrived, its pale light crept reluctantly across the floorboards, touching each corner of the apartment with a cold stillness. Elena dressed quietly, choosing her warmest sweater even though it had frayed at the cuffs. She moved with the heaviness of someone bracing for another difficult day. The storm had eased during the night, leaving a quiet blanket of snow that softened the city's harsh edges. But inside her chest, the dread from the notice still echoed with every heartbeat. She arrived at the diner early, unlocking the front door while the world outside was still waking. The familiar chime rang out, but instead of comfort, it stirred a faint anxiety at the base of her spine. She hung her coat by the kitchen door, smoothing her apron before tying it around her waist. The air held that pre-dawn chill, a cold that seemed to seep through the tiles beneath her feet. She told herself to breathe, to take the morning one task at a time. But the silence only amplified the thoughts she wished she could quiet. Not long after she started prepping the coffee machines, she heard Peter's footsteps approaching, sharp, quick, purposeful. He didn't greet her. He rarely did. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him to the small office in the back, his impatience written in the rigid line of his shoulders. Elena felt her stomach tighten, the eviction notice flashing in her mind like a warning flare. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped inside, bracing for something she feared might break the morning completely. Peter closed the office door behind them with a soft but decisive click. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow across the cramped room. He didn't sit. Instead, he crossed his arms and exhaled sharply, a sign she recognized all too well. "We need to talk about last night," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike. Elena nodded, though her pulse fluttered in her throat. She waited for him to continue, knowing kindness was not a language he spoke easily. He began with numbers, holiday revenue, weekly targets, end-of-year goals, each word landing with the heaviness of something she couldn't change. Then his tone sharpened. He accused her of giving away food without authorization, said the diner couldn't survive if employees acted on sentiment instead of protocol. Elena tried to respond, to explain the stranger's condition, the cold, the desperation in his eyes. But Peter cut her off, insisting that compassion had a place, but not when it cost the business money. As he spoke, she noticed how the light reflected off the framed certificates on the wall, awards he referenced often, proofs of his own ambition. They felt out of place in such a small, suffocating room, symbols of a world that valued profit over human need. Elena listened quietly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her throat tightening with each reprimand. She had endured many lectures from Peter, but this one hurt more, not because of the words, but because of how close she was to losing everything. When he finally paused, he let out a long breath and looked at her with something that pretended to be concern. "I'm not firing you," he said, though his tone carried no warmth, "but I'm docking your pay for the meal. You can't afford to make mistakes like this." The truth of that statement stung, sharper than he meant it to. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain composed. If she let emotions slip now, she feared it might overwhelm her entirely. Peter stepped aside, reaching for a clipboard to review the holiday schedule. His voice softened slightly, almost rehearsed. "You have potential, Elena, but you need to toughen up. Don't let every sad story get to you." She nodded again, though her thoughts drifted to the man she had helped, to the trembling gratitude in his eyes. Toughening up, she realized, had never been part of her nature, and she wasn't sure she wanted it to be. When she left the office, the diner felt different, quieter, heavier, as though judgment still lingered in the air. She stood behind the counter and inhaled slowly, willing her spirit to remain steady. But something subtle shifted in her chest, a small spark of defiance born from the mix of shame and dignity. She didn't regret helping the stranger, not for a moment. Yet as she adjusted the stack of menus and forced her hands to stop shaking, she felt a question rising inside her. How much longer could she survive in a world that punished compassion? And in that quiet, lingering question, her fate began to turn, though she could not yet see the forces moving toward her. The morning rush came slowly, as if the town itself had decided to move gently after the storm, but Eleanor felt anything but gentle inside. She moved between tables with practiced grace, though each step carried the weight of the conversation with Peter. The taste of humiliation still lingered, sharp and metallic, like the aftertaste of regret. She forced a small smile for the first customers, even as doubt whispered at the edges of her thoughts. Kindness, she reminded herself, shouldn't have to hurt. But today it did. A few regulars filtered in, their faces familiar yet distant, offering nods instead of greetings. Elena refilled coffee cups, wiped down counters, and straightened menus with the quiet precision of someone trying to stay unnoticed. She kept expecting someone to mention the incident from the night before, but the silence around her felt intentional, as though everyone sensed she had endured enough. Even so, the weight of invisible judgment pressed against her. Silence, she realized, could bruise just as deeply as words. A man seated by the window slipped on his coat and stood to leave, and Eleanor approached his table with a hopeful smile. He was one of the regulars known for his generous tips, the kind that sometimes helped her stretch groceries an extra day. But today, he didn't meet her eyes. He offered a polite nod, left a handful of crumbs on his plate, and walked out without placing anything beneath the saucer. The empty space where a tip should have been felt, like a small crack forming inside her chest. Even the diner felt colder because of it. She cleared the table slowly, letting her fingers linger on the warm porcelain cup as she tried to steady herself. One missed tip shouldn't matter so much, she told herself. But when your life depended on the difference between a few dollars, it mattered more than anyone realized. She carried the dishes to the sink, swallowing the frustration rising in her throat. The day had barely begun, and already she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Yet somewhere deep inside, the faintest thread of hope still flickered stubbornly. The door chimed again, letting in a gust of chilly air that brushed against her ankles. She turned to greet the newcomer, but her voice caught when she recognized one of Peter's old friends. Someone with influence, someone who always carried an air of superiority. He scanned the room with disapproval before settling into a booth. Elena approached him with caution, knowing he enjoyed pointing out flaws in service. She braced herself as she took his order, his curt tone slicing through her remaining optimism. When she returned with his coffee, he scrutinized her as though searching for something to criticize. "You look tired," he muttered, as if exhaustion were a personal failing. She thanked him anyway, setting the cup down with gentle precision. His dismissal stung, but she refused to let it show. There was dignity in silence, she believed, though some days that silence felt unbearably heavy. She walked away slowly, her shoulders stiff but her step steady. Strength, she reminded herself, didn't always feel like strength in the moment. As the hours passed, Eleanor noticed her hands trembling slightly from hunger. Her shift didn't allow breaks during busy mornings, and she hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon. She stole a moment behind the counter, taking a slow breath and pressing her palm against her stomach to quiet the ache. She would push through. It was what she always did. But as she looked around the diner, she wondered how long a person could live balancing between exhaustion and hope without breaking. Peter emerged from the office, clipboard in hand, scanning receipts as though searching for another mistake to place at her feet. She felt his presence behind her before he even spoke, his disapproval settling into her spine like cold hands. "Make sure you upsell the holiday specials," he said without looking up. "We can't afford any more losses this week." And the implication hung unspoken, sharp enough to wound. Elena nodded quietly and returned to her tables, though each word still stung. A mother with her young daughter sat near the back, and when the little girl smiled up at Elena, something soft warmed her chest, like a tiny patch of sunlight breaking through a heavy sky. The child thanked her sweetly when she brought their pancakes, and for a moment Elena felt her spirit lift. Small kindnesses mattered too. They didn't erase the hurt, but they stitched tiny threads of light through the darker moments, and she clung to that warmth for as long as it would stay. By midday, the diner hummed with movement again, and Elena found herself moving more quickly, more confidently, as though refusing to let discouragement claim the day entirely. She wiped down a counter, watching the snow melt into slush outside, and let a quiet breath escape her chest. She wasn't broken, not yet. But beneath the rhythm of her work, a question lingered softly, tugging at her thoughts like a fragile warning. How many more small wounds could she withstand before the breaking point arrived? The afternoon light thinned across the diner, turning the windows into pale sheets of winter gold, and Elena felt the shift in the air, even before Peter stepped out of the back room. His presence always arrived before his voice, a kind of stiffness that settled across the space like frost. She caught sight of him approaching from the corner of her eye, his expression already shaped into disapproval. The tension she carried all morning pulled tighter, and she braced herself, knowing what was coming. Peter walked straight to the counter, lifted the cash register drawer, and snapped it shut with deliberate force. The sound cracked through the diner like a reprimand all its own. He turned toward her, arms crossed, head tilted with the authority he wielded too easily. "I checked the cameras," he announced, as if delivering a verdict. "I saw you give that man a full meal last night, without asking, without authorization." His tone suggested betrayal, not compassion. Eleanor felt the heat rise to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to explain, but he lifted a hand sharply, silencing her before her voice could even steady. "You can't keep doing things like that," he continued, each word clipped and precise. "This is a business, not a charity. If you want to survive here, you need to start thinking like someone who cares about the bottom line." His words stung more deeply than he understood, not because they were harsh, but because they dismissed everything she held sacred. She stood still, swallowing the hurt. The diner remained quiet, customers unaware of the quiet battle unfolding behind the counter, though one or two glanced up curiously at Peter's raised voice. Elena felt their eyes on her, sharp as needles, and the humiliation settled over her shoulders with a heaviness she knew too well. She lowered her gaze, not out of guilt, but to gather what remained of her dignity. She had made the choice she believed was right, yet standing here beneath Peter's glare, she felt the cost of that choice more acutely than ever. A part of her wanted to defend herself, to stand up straight and meet Peter's eyes, to remind him that kindness was not a weakness. But the reality of her situation held her voice captive. Rent overdue, schedule unstable, income fragile. She could not afford another confrontation. Instead, she breathed slowly, willing her hands to remain steady as she wiped the counter with slow, deliberate movements. Her silence wasn't submission, it was survival, and survival, she had learned, often required swallowing pride. Peter leaned closer, his voice lowering into something he likely thought sounded reasonable. "Employees who think with their hearts instead of their heads don't last long," he said. "People take advantage of that." His palm tapped the counter, punctuating the lesson. But Eleanor heard something else beneath his words, a belief that the world was cold by nature and that softness only led to loss. She wondered how someone became that rigid, that certain, and she wondered whether she could remain herself in a place ruled by such thinking. When he finally stepped back, he shook his head with a sigh, the kind intended to make her feel small. "I expect better judgment from you," he said, turning away to greet new customers with a smile he had never offered her. Elena watched him go, her chest tight but her spirit stubborn. He did not know the trembling man's eyes. He did not know the storm outside or the hunger carved into that stranger's bones. And he did not understand that compassion was not a mistake. It was a mirror of who she refused to stop being. As the hours passed, the sting of humiliation softened into something steadier, an inner resistance that pulsed quietly beneath her ribs. She moved through the diner with renewed purpose, her steps measured, her voice gentle, her heart still intact despite every attempt to harden it. She noticed how the little girl from earlier waved at her again, how an elderly couple left her a small tip folded neatly beneath their plate. Small moments, but enough to remind her that the world was not as cold as Peter believed. Near the end of her shift, she paused by the window to watch snow begin falling again, soft and steady, as though winter was starting all over. The reflection staring back at her looked tired, but not defeated. She hadn't allowed Peter's words to reshape who she was, even if they bruised her pride. Still, the day's wounds had gathered quietly, layering one upon another like flakes accumulating on a roof. Light at first, but growing heavy with time. As she gathered her coat and prepared to leave, a faint unease stirred within her, whispering that something larger was approaching, something that would push her endurance far beyond the bruises of humiliation. She didn't know why the feeling rose so strongly, only that the air felt different, thicker, waiting. And as she stepped toward the door, pulling the collar of her coat closer to her neck, she sensed the fragile balance of her life shifting again, subtle but undeniable. For the first time that day, she wondered how much heavier the weight could grow before something finally gave way. The cold evening wrapped itself around Elena the moment she stepped off the bus, the wind slicing through the layers of her coat as though determined to reach her bones. She hurried along the dimly lit sidewalk, her breath forming pale clouds that drifted upward like fragile spirits. The neighborhood was quiet, windows glowing softly with Christmas lights and laughter she could almost hear. But none of that warmth belonged to her tonight. All she wanted was the small comfort of her apartment, a place to rest before the weight of life pressed any harder. When she reached her building, she climbed the stairs slowly, every step echoing with the exhaustion gathered from days of worry. She fumbled in her pocket for her key, the familiar curve of the metal bringing a small measure of reassurance. But as she reached the top landing, her breath caught suddenly in her throat. Something was taped to her door, something large, bright, and impossible to overlook. The red lettering glared at her from the dimly lit hallway, harsh and unapologetic. Her heart began to pound even before she stepped closer. The eviction notice had returned, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was final. The deadline had passed. The decision was made. Elena's fingers trembled as she peeled the paper from the door, her eyes skimming the words she had been dreading. Immediate vacate required. No extensions, no leniency, no negotiation. She felt her stomach drop, leaving her hollow in a way she hadn't known was possible. The hallway around her tilted slightly, as though her world had shifted off its familiar axis. She unlocked the door with numb hands and stepped inside, the soft click behind her sounding strangely final. The apartment felt colder than usual, shadows stretching long across the floor as if reaching for her. She sank to the ground slowly, the notice still clutched in her hand, the weight of it heavier than anything she had ever carried. Her shoulders trembled as the truth settled fully into her chest. This was it. She had nowhere left to fall. Survival had demanded too much for too long, and tonight it had taken everything. For a long time she sat in silence, her breath shallow, her thoughts tangled in fear. She tried to imagine calling her grandmother, but the thought of worrying her felt unbearable. She tried to imagine asking friends for help, but she had spent so long being the one who carried her own weight. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the tears slip quietly, falling onto the notice that had rewritten her immediate future. Loneliness pressed into her like a second winter, colder than the one outside. The room around her seemed to echo with memories, flashbacks of evenings spent sipping tea, moments of laughter shared with her grandmother during video calls, the quiet peace of cooking late at night. All of it felt like a life that belonged to someone else now. She pressed her hand over her heart, as though trying to anchor herself to the present before it scattered into pieces. Her breath shook. She had given away her last $15 to feed a stranger. And now she didn't know where she would sleep tomorrow. Eventually she rose to her feet and moved slowly toward the small dresser, pulling out a canvas bag worn by years of use. She began placing a few belongings inside. Her grandmother's scarf, her notebook of recipes, a change of clothes, the photograph frame she held dear. Each item felt like a small goodbye to the place she had called home. Her hands lingered on every object longer than necessary, as though memorizing the feel of them, knowing she might not hold them again for a while. The ache in her chest tightened with every movement. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the window pane, its mournful whistling seeping into the room, filling the silence with something deeply lonesome. Eleanor moved to the bed and sat on the edge, gripping the bag in her lap. The tears had stopped, but the hollowness remained, a quiet, steady ache that replaced her breath with something heavier. She wasn't sure what morning would bring. She wasn't sure she had anything left to lose. Yet even in that darkness, a faint ember of spirit still flickered, fragile but persistent. She wiped her face and stood, stepping toward the door as if preparing herself to face whatever came next. But before she could reach for the knob, a sudden sound broke through the quiet. 3 sharp knocks, unexpected and unmistakable, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Her breath froze mid-inhale. The bag slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the floor. Someone was outside, someone who knew exactly where to find her, even at her lowest moment. And as the knocks echoed again, more urgent this time, Elena realized with a chilling certainty that this moment, this fragile, trembling moment, was the point where her life would change forever. The doorknob began to turn. Elena froze in place as the doorknob twitched, her breath held hostage somewhere between her ribs and her throat. But after a few tense seconds, the movement stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the knocks themselves, settling across the room with an almost physical weight. She stepped closer, listening, but the hallway remained still. When she finally opened the door, a crack. No one stood outside, only the faint echo of footsteps fading down the stairs. The emptiness left behind murmured more questions than answers. She closed the door softly and leaned her forehead against it, allowing the wooden frame to catch the tremor running through her body. Fear and exhaustion twisted together in her chest, making it difficult to breathe evenly. She wasn't sure whether the knocks had been a threat, a warning, or simply a mistake. But the timing, coming moments after her world collapsed, made the uncertainty feel sharper. She turned the lock gently, needing at least the illusion of safety. The deadbolt clicked into place, with a sound that felt too small to protect her. The apartment, dimly lit by a single lamp, felt different now, emptier, somehow hollowed out by the knowledge that it no longer belonged to her. She walked to the window and watched the snow swirl beneath the streetlight, its quiet dance both soothing and distant. Light from a neighbor's Christmas tree blinked faintly through the glass across the courtyard, each sparkle a reminder of a joy she couldn't reach tonight. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cold inside deeper than the winter outside. Loneliness pressed into her like a slow, steady tide. She returned to the bed, sitting on the edge as fatigue settled across her shoulders like a heavy blanket. Her gaze drifted to the canvas bag, waiting on the floor. Packed, ready, a symbol of displacement she hadn't yet allowed herself to accept. She wiped her palms against her knees, trying to still the shaking she couldn't quite control. The silence around her deepened, filling the room with the quiet ache of uncertainty. And in that quiet, her thoughts began to spiral. For the first time in years, Elena clasped her hands together, not out of habit, but out of a fragile instinct rooted deep in childhood. She closed her eyes and whispered a small, trembling prayer, unsure if anyone was listening. "Just help me hold on," she murmured, her voice cracking under the weight of the plea. She didn't ask for miracles. She didn't ask for rescue. She asked only for strength enough to face tomorrow. And somehow, the simple act of speaking the words eased a fraction of her fear. Memories surfaced, her grandmother humming softly while stirring a pot of soup, her voice full of calm certainty that the world still had goodness hidden within it. Elena tried to imagine that warmth now, tried to let it wrap around her like a comfort she hadn't felt in years. But tonight, even those memories felt fragile, like paper held too close to a flame. She lay back on the mattress and stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the heating pipes as though they were the heartbeat of the building. The sound steadied her, if only a little. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the soft ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional gust of wind rattling the window frame. Elena drifted in and out of shallow rest, each moment of stillness interrupted by the cold worry curling around her thoughts. She imagined herself walking the streets tomorrow with nowhere to go, imagined the stranger she had helped wandering somewhere in the storm. Those two images blended together in her mind, two people lost in different ways. The weight of that parallel ached inside her. Sometime after midnight, she rose from the bed again, too restless to remain still. She walked through the small apartment, touching the back of a chair, the corner of a counter, the edge of a shelf, small, familiar items that had made this place a home. Each touch felt like a goodbye, softened by longing. She stood at the kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass, and watched the snow settle on the street in thick, gentle layers. Everything looked peaceful, untouched, as though the world beyond the glass lived separate from her worries. It was beautiful, and it hurt to look at. She finally returned to the bed and wrapped her grandmother's scarf around her shoulders, pulling it close as though it could shield her from everything closing in on her life. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that tugged her back to a safer, simpler time. She whispered another prayer, quieter than before, a small plea to the night itself. Just let me find a way through this. Her eyes slid closed, exhaustion finally pulling her into a fragile drift between waking and sleep. And as she rested, a strange calm began to settle across her spirit. Yet even in that fragile calm, a feeling lingered. Something faint, something unformed, something like a gentle stirring beneath the surface of the night. Elena couldn't name it, couldn't fully sense it, but it hovered at the edge of her awareness like the soft glow of dawn hiding behind distant hills. And as the snow continued to fall in the silence outside, she felt, without understanding why, that tomorrow would bring something different, something she had not yet imagined. She just didn't know whether that difference would break her, or finally begin to lift her. Morning arrived quietly, slipping through the curtains with a pale golden light that rested gently on the floorboards. Elena woke slowly, her body stiff from a restless night, her mind heavy with thoughts she hadn't been ready to face. For a moment she remained still, clutching her grandmother's scarf, listening to the faint hum of the city waking beyond the glass. The room felt different somehow, still heavy, but not as suffocating as the night before. She exhaled, long and shaky, and pushed herself upright. She had survived the night. That was something. She stood and moved to the window, wiping a small circle in the frosted glass with the sleeve of her sweater. The street below lay softened beneath a fresh layer of snow, untouched and glistening in the early morning light. The storm had calmed, leaving a world that looked cleaner, quieter, almost renewed. Elena watched a few bundled silhouettes hurry past, their breath visible in tiny clouds. Somehow the quiet scene steadied her, like the world itself was offering her a moment of gentleness before the day's struggles returned. She let that small comfort seep into her tired spirit. After dressing, she gathered her canvas bag, preparing herself for a day that promised no miracles, only routine, only endurance. But when she stepped into the hallway and locked her door, she noticed something unusual at her feet. The walkway just outside her unit had been swept clear of snow, leaving a neat path leading all the way to the building's stairs. Every other doorstep remained buried beneath untouched drifts, but hers alone had been tended. She frowned softly, bending down to touch the cleared concrete. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it wrapped warmth around her chest. Someone had done this for her, someone who had thought of her. As she descended the stairs, she noticed salt sprinkled carefully along each step, just enough to keep her safe from slipping. She paused halfway down, her fingers curling around the railing as she tried to comprehend the simple kindness. It wasn't the building manager, he barely bothered with the main walkway, and it didn't seem like a neighbor's doing. No one had ever gone out of their way for her before, not like this. The realization pressed gently into her heart, fragile but powerful. Kindness still existed in the world, even if she didn't always see it. Outside, the cold bit at her cheeks, but something inside her resisted the chill. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, her boots crunching softly through the snow. The sky held a faint glow behind a thin veil of clouds, promising a clearer day. The ache of the eviction notice still lingered in her chest, but the memory of the swept walkway nudged against it, easing the weight just enough to let her breathe. Maybe the universe hadn't forgotten her entirely. Maybe someone, somewhere, cared enough to offer her a small mercy. At the diner, she unlocked the door and stepped into the familiar quiet. The stillness before the machines whirred to life, before the first customer asked for coffee, before Peter's impatience stretched across the morning. She flicked on the lights, watching the room brighten in soft stages, revealing the modest decorations and garlands she had hung days earlier. The glow brought a momentary warmth that settled lightly across her shoulders. She placed her bag under the counter and allowed herself a rare, gentle smile. Today felt different, subtly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but different. As she prepared the coffee machines, she kept thinking of the swept snow. The act echoed in her thoughts with surprising clarity, as though it held a meaning she hadn't yet uncovered. People didn't do such things without reason. And while logic suggested coincidence, her heart whispered something else, something she couldn't yet name. She brushed her hair behind her ear and let that faint whisper linger, allowing it to soften the edges of her anxiety. Hope, she realized, sometimes arrived in small gestures rather than grand miracles. By the time the first customers entered, Elena felt more grounded than she had in days. She greeted them with a measured warmth, her voice steadier than before. Her exhaustion hadn't vanished, nor had her problems, but beneath everything lived a quiet reserve of strength she hadn't felt in a long time. She moved through the diner with graceful, deliberate motions, allowing the rhythm of work to carry her. And for the first time since the eviction notice, she felt capable of facing the hours ahead. Yet even as she settled into the morning routine, the memory of the cleared walkway remained in the back of her mind, pulsing softly like a distant signal. It wasn't the gesture itself that unsettled her, it was the question behind it. Who would go out into the snow before dawn to help her, silently, without expecting recognition? The mystery lingered, threading curiosity through her thoughts as she refilled the sugar dispensers and wiped the counter clean. And beneath that curiosity, a strange sense of anticipation began to grow. As the door chimed lightly and a gust of cold air swept into the diner, Eleanor glanced up instinctively. For a split second, she felt something stir inside her, a faint tremor of recognition, as though the world were shifting in the exact direction of that small, mysterious act of kindness. She didn't yet understand why her heart tightened in place, or why the morning suddenly felt charged with quiet expectancy. But she sensed, in a way she couldn't explain, that the hand which cleared her path had not finished writing its place in her story. The morning rush had just begun to settle into its usual rhythm when the diner door swung open with a sudden gust of cold air, the bell above it chiming sharply as though startled by the force. Elena looked up from the register, expecting another regular wrapped in layers of winter wear. But the man who stepped inside was nothing like the worn figures she had served all morning. He carried an unmistakable presence, one built from confidence, command, and an aura that didn't belong in a place as humble as Snowflake's corner. Elena's breath slipped from her chest before she even understood why. The man stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the warmth of the diner settle over him, brushing a few flakes of snow from the shoulder of an immaculate charcoal overcoat. The fabric was expensive, tailored with precision, the kind of coat worn by people who lived far from struggle. Two individuals followed closely behind him, assistants from the look of their posture and their quiet urgency. Their presence filled the small restaurant with a gravity that Elena felt deep in her bones. She blinked, confused, unsettled. She didn't know this man, at least, she didn't think she did. But then he lifted his gaze, and Elena's world tilted. The eyes, those same eyes she had seen trembling with exhaustion the night before, drowning in the storm's cold, now shone with clarity, strength, and something hauntingly familiar. Her heart lurched once, painfully, as recognition hit her like a sudden swell. It was him. The stranger she had fed, the man who could barely hold a spoon, the man who whispered thank you, like it cost him everything. Only now he was someone else entirely. Her hands tightened around the edge of the counter, steadying herself as he took a few steps forward, each one measured and deliberate. Gone was the soaked jacket, the trembling posture, the defeated aura. In its place stood a man who appeared sculpted by influence, his posture straight, his movements composed, his expression unreadable. He didn't look like someone on the edge of collapse anymore. He looked like someone who belonged to a very different world. For a moment, she wondered if she was imagining the similarity. But no, those eyes were unmistakable. The assistants whispered to one another, scanning the diner as though ensuring everything met invisible standards. Elena felt small beneath their gaze, but her attention returned to the man as he removed his gloves slowly, methodically. He approached the counter with a quiet intensity, and every sound in the diner seemed to fade. The clinking of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the hum of the coffee machine, all softened under the weight of the moment. Elena swallowed hard, her mind racing to reconcile the man she'd helped with the one now standing before her. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low, resonant, but softened at the edges by something she couldn't name. "Good morning," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a gravity that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. She managed a quiet greeting in return, her voice barely above a whisper. He studied her for a heartbeat too long, as though searching her face for something only he could recognize. Then he offered the faintest, smallest smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes, but carried the weight of gratitude unspoken. Elena's breath stilled. Around them, customers had begun to notice the man's presence. A few whispered to each other, eyebrows raised, glances exchanged, clearly recognizing someone of significance, even if they didn't know his name. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks as eyes shifted between him and her. She wished she could disappear behind the counter, hide from the sudden attention, but the man's focus never wavered. It stayed fixed on her, steady and unwavering, and something in his expression suggested this moment meant more than she yet understood. He placed one gloved hand gently on the counter, as though grounding himself. "I came back," he said softly, the words simple but laden with meaning that sent a quiet tremor through her chest. Elena couldn't speak at first. She nodded instead, unsure what else to do, unsure how to navigate the flood of questions rising within her. Why had he returned? How had he transformed so completely? Why did his presence feel like both an answer and a new uncertainty all at once? She felt the edges of her world begin to shift. Before she could gather her voice, he glanced briefly toward his assistants, then back at her, something unspoken flickering across his eyes, something that looked suspiciously like vulnerability. "There's something I need to discuss with you," he murmured, voice lowering just enough that only she could hear. The sentence sent a ripple of heat and confusion through her chest, and she stepped back slightly, instinctively bracing herself. Whatever he wanted to say, she sensed it wouldn't be simple, it wouldn't be casual, it wouldn't be small. Elena swallowed, her heart pounding hard enough that she wondered if he could hear it. There was something about the moment that felt suspended, like the world was holding itself still, waiting for whatever came next. The swept walkway. The strange feeling that morning, the door swinging open now with impossible timing, all of it converged into a single, breathless question that tightened in her chest. And as he drew a quiet breath, preparing to speak, she realized her life was seconds away from changing again, this time in a way she could not yet imagine. For a long moment, the man simply stood there, gathering his breath as though the words he carried had been waiting for the right moment to surface. Elena felt the world shrink to the narrow space between them, the hum of the diner fading into a soft blur. His gaze held hers with an intensity that made her pulse flutter, steady, yet strangely fragile. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than she expected. "You don't know what you did for me that night." The phrase settled between them like a fragile truth, delicate and heavy all at once. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, her hands clasping instinctively in front of her apron. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came. The man gave a faint, almost apologetic smile, as though he understood the confusion sparking inside her. "I wasn't myself," he continued, his words measured, searching. "I was wandering the city because I didn't know where else to go. Everything felt like it was collapsing around me." He paused, lowering his eyes briefly, as if revisiting the memory hurt more than he wanted to admit. "I didn't expect help from anyone." She watched him, her heart tugging unexpectedly at the vulnerability beneath his polished exterior. He looked so different now, steady, grounded, in control. But his voice held the tremor of someone who'd walked dangerously close to the edge. "When you handed me that bowl of soup," he said, lifting his gaze again, "it was the first warmth I'd felt in days. Maybe longer." His throat tightened slightly on the last word. "You didn't just give me food, you reminded me that people still care." The sincerity in his tone caught her off guard. Elena exhaled slowly, a tight knot forming beneath her ribs. She had offered kindness out of instinct, never imagining it had reached someone this deeply. The contrast between the man from the night before and the one now standing before her felt surreal. "I just didn't want you to freeze," she whispered. The man's expression softened, genuinely this time, and for a brief second he looked less like someone powerful and more like someone profoundly human. "You did much more than that," he murmured. One of his assistants approached quietly, leaning toward him with a hesitant whisper, as if reminding him of a schedule or obligation. He nodded once, dismissing the concern, but the interruption seemed to shift something inside him. His expression turned more focused, more deliberate, as though a decision he had been carrying was ready to surface. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, lowering his voice again. "Something I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to say." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, a mix of anticipation and unease coiling inside her. He stepped a little closer, lowering his tone so only she could hear. "The night you helped me," he said, "I wasn't just lost. I was running." Elena's eyes widened slightly, but he continued before she could speak. "From responsibilities, from expectations, from a life that felt like it was swallowing me whole." His jaw tightened subtly, a glimpse of a burden still not fully lifted. "I needed to disappear for a few hours, to breathe. I didn't think anyone would see me or care." His confession carried more weight than she understood. Her mind swirled with questions she couldn't form quickly enough. Running from what? From whom? How could someone who now walked like a man in command have been so close to breaking? The puzzle of him deepened with every sentence he spoke, and yet something in her intuition whispered that the story he carried was larger than he was ready to share. His eyes searched hers again, as though checking whether she was prepared for the truth. She wasn't sure she was, but she also wasn't sure she could look away. The diner around them moved in a slow haze, voices blending into the soft clatter of dishes, footsteps drifting like distant echoes. Yet the man seemed entirely removed from that world, anchored only to the moment between them. "You saved me from making a decision I might not have come back from," he said softly, the words trembling with honesty. "And I can't let that go unanswered." Elena felt her breath stutter, the weight of his gratitude settling across her like a quiet, unexpected warmth. But uncertainty still curled in her chest. What could he possibly mean by that? He reached into his coat pocket, his movements controlled but tinged with something almost hesitant. When his hand emerged, it held a small envelope, cream-colored, sealed, unmarked. He placed it gently on the counter between them, his fingertips lingering on the edge for a single heartbeat. Eleanor looked down at it, her pulse quickening with confusion and unease. "This," he said, "is only the beginning of what I need to return to you." His tone carried a promise she wasn't sure she was ready to receive. She slowly lifted her gaze back to his, her breath catching when she saw the seriousness, no, the urgency, behind his expression. He took a quiet breath, steadying himself as though what came next required courage, even from him. "Elena," he said softly, "you deserve to know who I really am." Her heart slammed once beneath her ribs, the air sharpening around her. His assistant straightened, sensing the moment shifting. The diner seemed to still around them, the lights flickering faintly as though holding their breath. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak the truth he had been holding back, the diner door swung open with a sharp burst of cold air. Peter walking in with the morning's invoices, his voice already raised, completely unaware of the precipice Eleanor stood on. The man froze mid-sentence, his revelation suspended in the air, unfinished, unreachable, as Peter's loud greeting shattered the fragile moment. Peter marched into the diner with the clatter of someone who believed every room was his to control, his voice echoing before he even took in the scene before him. Elena stiffened instinctively, her gaze darting from Peter to the man who still stood poised at the edge of a life-changing confession. The envelope remained on the counter between them, glowing faintly under the diner's overhead lights. The moment hung in delicate suspension, but Peter's obliviousness sliced through it with clumsy force. "Morning, Elena," he said briskly. "We need to review last night's closing numbers." The stranger's expression shifted instantly, his calm composure tightening as he watched Peter approach. The assistants straightened at his sides, subtly adjusting their stance as though readying themselves. Peter barely spared them a glance, and when he finally did, the dismissiveness in his eyes made Elena's stomach twist. "Can I help you folks?" he asked flatly, clearly unaware of who stood before him. The stranger exchanged a brief, quiet look with his assistants, one that suggested patience quickly thinning. Elena sensed the air change. Peter turned to Elena again, frustration already brewing in his voice. "Why are you standing around? There are tables to clear." His tone was sharp, irritated, the same tone he used when he wanted to remind her of her place. A flush crept into her cheeks, humiliation rising uninvited. She opened her mouth to speak, to somehow bridge the gap between two worlds colliding at once, but the stranger stepped forward before she could get a word out. His presence shifted the entire room, the quiet authority radiating from him like a slow, deliberate tide. "I believe," the man said calmly, "that Eleanor was speaking with me." The diner fell silent. Peter blinked at him, taken aback by the tone, refined, controlled, unmistakably confident. But instead of stepping back, he attempted a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh? Well, she works here, and I need her attention." The stranger studied him for a long moment, and Elena saw something sharpen behind his gaze, a decision forming. The assistants remained motionless, their eyes fixed on Peter with polite neutrality that somehow amplified the tension. A few customers had stopped eating, sensing something unusual in the air. "Your employee showed kindness when most people would have turned away," the man said, his voice low but carrying the weight of someone used to being heard. "Last night, she made a choice that may have very well saved a life." Elena felt a breath hitch in her chest, her eyes widening. Peter let out a short, dismissive laugh. "A life? She gave free food to someone who couldn't pay. That's not saving a life. That's ignoring protocol." His words struck Elena like small, precise blows, each one erasing the meaning behind what she had done. The stranger's jaw tightened, subtle but unmistakable. "Protocol," he repeated, his tone a shade colder, "has nothing to do with humanity." The room seemed to shrink around them, every sound fading. Peter's smile faltered, confusion slipping across his features. "Look," he said, straightening his posture. "This is a business. I can't have employees giving things away out of pity." The man stepped closer, and though his movements were calm, the shift in energy was undeniable. The two worlds, Peter's rigid pride and the stranger's quiet authority, finally collided. "You don't understand what she did," the man said, "or what it cost her." His voice held no anger, only truth. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding, uncertain whether to breathe or hide. Peter rolled his eyes, waving a hand dismissively. "I run this place. I understand exactly what goes on here." A soft, controlled breath escaped the man, as though he recognized the futility of arguing with someone who refused to see beyond numbers and rules. But he wasn't done. Not yet. He reached into his coat, slowly, deliberately, drawing out a sleek wallet. Peter's expression shifted instantly, greedy recognition flickering across his features. "If this is about paying for the meal," Peter began, "there's no need for theatrics. A few dollars and—" The man lifted a hand, silencing him with barely a gesture. The dignity in that simple movement sent a ripple through the room. Eleanor watched, breathless, as he pulled out a card, heavy, metallic, unmistakably exclusive. "No," the man said, his tone final. "This isn't about the meal. It's about respect." The words landed like a quiet thunder, the kind that shakes without raising its voice. Peter stared at him, bewildered, clearly trying to decide whether he was being challenged or lectured. "Who exactly are you?" he finally asked, impatience bleeding into his tone. The stranger paused, his gaze shifting briefly toward Elena. Something tender flickered there, something that softened the harsh edges of the confrontation. Elena felt her breath catch. She knew he was about to reveal the truth he had been trying to share earlier. But before the revelation could leave his lips, one of his assistants stepped up and whispered urgently into his ear. Something quick, something unmistakably serious. The man's expression changed, just slightly, but enough to halt the moment entirely. Whatever he heard couldn't wait. He nodded once, then looked back at Elena, apology flickering in his eyes. "Elena, please wait. I need to tell you something important. Something about last night and about who I am." The diner fell into a hush so complete that even the clatter of dishes from the back faded into nothing, as though the entire room were bracing for the words the man had been holding back. Elena stood frozen behind the counter, her pulse quickening as he watched her with a quiet certainty that unsettled her heart. Peter shifted beside them, irritation brewing, unaware of the precipice he was about to step onto. The stranger straightened his coat with an almost ceremonial calm. And then, with the kind of composure only power could grant, he finally spoke his truth. "My name," he began, each word steady and resonant, "is Gabriel Steele." The name drifted across the diner like a gust of cold air. Several customers gasped softly, turning toward him with wide, stunned eyes. Even Elena felt her breath catch as memories surfaced. News articles, magazine covers, whispered conversations about a billionaire who vanished from public view months ago. Gabriel Steele. The man whose business empire spanned industries. The man whose face had once been everywhere. The same man she had fed with her last $15. Her knees weakened beneath her, and she clutched the counter to steady herself, struggling to match the man before her with the broken figure from that stormy night. Peter blinked, confusion turning into disbelief, then into something frantic and unsteady. "Gabriel Steele," he stammered, adjusting his tie as though preparing for a performance he never rehearsed. "Mr. Steele, I had no idea. If I had known—" Gabriel lifted a hand, silencing him with a quiet authority that left no room for excuses. "You didn't need to know who I was," he replied calmly. "You only needed to know how to treat another human being." His words, soft but cutting, struck Peter harder than a raised voice ever could. Elena stared at Gabriel, her breath trembling, her mind struggling to reconcile the billionaire with the man who had barely held himself together in her booth. He turned toward her, his expression softening in a way that felt entirely separate from the power he carried. "You showed me compassion when I was at my lowest," he said, voice gentler now. "When I had nothing to offer you, no name, no status, no promise of anything in return." He paused, letting the truth settle between them. "And that kind of kindness deserves something far better than what you've been given here." Peter's face paled, his earlier arrogance dissolving into panic. "Mr. Steele, please, Elena misunderstood procedures, that's all. I assure you, this won't happen again." Gabriel turned fully toward him, and the calm in his voice sharpened. "You're right," he said. "It won't." The words echoed with intention, firm but not cruel. Peter swallowed hard, glancing around as though hoping someone might rescue him from the unraveling he'd brought upon himself. But the silence of the diner stood firmly against him. Gabriel reached into his coat pocket, retrieving a document folded with crisp precision. He placed it gently on the counter, sliding it toward Peter with deliberate finality. "I bought this diner this morning," he said simply. The room erupted into stunned whispers. Peter gasped, reaching for the paper with trembling fingers, scanning the text as though hoping it might rewrite itself. His shoulders sagged as the truth hit him. Control of the diner had slipped entirely from his grasp. Elena watched, stunned, struggling to breathe through the surge of disbelief swelling in her chest. "And," Gabriel continued, turning back to Elena with an expression filled with something warm, something grateful, "I want you to stay. Not as a waitress, but as the new manager." The words struck her like a wave, gentle but overwhelming. She stared at him, speechless, unable to trust the reality of what he had just offered. Her throat tightened, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and awe. "Me," she whispered, the word barely finding its way out. Gabriel nodded, his smile faint but sincere. "There's no one more deserving." Peter stumbled forward, desperation leaking into his voice. "You can't be serious. She gave away food. Gabriel cut him off with a steady, unyielding look. "She fed a man who needed help. You belittled her for it." The sentence hung in the air like a verdict. For once Peter fell silent. His pride, so rigid moments before, seemed to deflate under the weight of his own reflection. And though humiliation flickered in his eyes, Eleanor saw something else too, something like recognition, perhaps even regret, hidden beneath layers of ego. Elena felt tears rising not from sadness, but from the immense disorienting relief swelling inside her. Everything she had lost, everything she had feared, everything she had endured. Suddenly, the world felt different. Not fixed, not perfect, but shifting towards something kinder than she had believed possible. Gabriel stepped closer, lowering his voice as he spoke only to her. "You restored my faith in people," he said quietly. "Let me help restore yours." Her chest trembled with gratitude she couldn't yet voice. As the customers murmured and Peter lingered in stunned silence, the entire diner seemed to breathe differently, lighter, warmer, transformed. Elena wiped her cheeks, trying to steady herself, trying to understand how such a change could arrive so swiftly, so unexpectedly. Gabriel looked at her with a gentleness that steadied the storm inside her. "We'll talk more soon," he said softly. "There's still something important you need to know." The promise echoed through her, quiet but profound. And though she didn't yet know what truth he still carried, Eleanor sensed that the next revelation would reach deeper than any act of generosity he had shown so far. The rest of the day moved like a soft blur, as if the world itself had chosen to give Eleanor time to absorb the shock of everything that had unfolded. When the diner finally closed, she stepped out into the gentle snowfall, the flakes drifting slowly through the street lamps like feathers from some quiet heaven. Her breath rose in warm clouds, but for the first time in weeks, the cold didn't bite. It felt almost comforting, like an old friend who had stopped pretending to be cruel. She wrapped her grandmother's scarf around her neck and let a small, trembling smile rise. She felt lighter than she had in years. Later that evening, Elena returned to her apartment, still hers at least for now, and placed her bag on the table with deliberate slowness. The eviction notice lay where she had left it, its harsh red letters once capable of collapsing her spirit. But tonight it didn't carry the same weight. Instead, she folded it gently and placed it in a drawer, not out of denial, but out of trust that something new was unfolding. A quiet hum filled the room, as though it sensed the shift in her fate. She took a deep breath, steadying herself in the stillness. The next morning she woke early, filled with a strange blend of anticipation and calm. Gabriel had left the diner the day before with a promise to return soon, and though she didn't fully understand why it mattered so much, the thought warmed her. She spent the morning packing her belongings carefully, aware that her current apartment was days away from no longer being hers. But instead of dread, she felt clarity. She packed only what she truly loved: her grandmother's scarf, her notebook of recipes, a few cherished books. The rest she let go of without bitterness. A few hours later, as she waited for the bus with her bag at her feet, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside her, its tinted window lowering to reveal one of Gabriel's assistants. "Miss Marquez," he said gently, "Mr. Steele asked that we bring you somewhere." Elena blinked, startled but not frightened. Something about the assistant's tone carried reassurance rather than urgency. She climbed into the warm vehicle, her hands settling nervously on her lap as the city streets passed quietly outside. She didn't know where she was going, but for once, uncertainty didn't feel like danger. The SUV stopped in front of an apartment building she had only admired from afar. Clean brick, soft lighting, a small garden still dusted with snow. Elena stepped out slowly, her breath catching in her throat as Gabriel emerged from the lobby, his expression warm but humble. "I thought we could talk somewhere quieter," he said. His tone was gentle, lacking the imposing authority he had shown at the diner. He guided her inside, and she followed, feeling a softness in her chest that she had not felt in years. The apartment he led her to was modest but elegant. Sunlit, warm, cozy in a way that reminded her of childhood winters. "I took the liberty of arranging a temporary lease for you," Gabriel said almost shyly, "just until you're steady again. No obligations, no strings." Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, her breath trembling. "Gabriel, this is too much." He shook his head. "What you gave me was more than a bowl of soup. You gave me back a piece of myself. This is the least I can do." His sincerity wrapped around her like a blanket. They sat together for a long while, sharing pieces of their stories, hers filled with struggle and quiet resilience, his threaded with success that had grown so heavy it nearly crushed him. He confessed that the night she fed him had come after months of burnout, grief and isolation he had kept hidden from the world. "You were the first person in a long time who made me feel human again," he said softly. Elena's eyes warmed with tears, not from sadness, but from the profound connection blooming between them. Later, he drove her to visit her grandmother, surprising her with a basket of groceries and a few thoughtful gifts. Elena watched as her grandmother embraced Gabriel with the warmth she extended to all gentle souls. The small living room felt alive with laughter, flickering light, and the scent of warm tea. For a moment, Eleanor felt wrapped in a world she had not known in years, a world where she wasn't alone, where kindness wasn't a sacrifice, where hope felt natural instead of borrowed. Healing, she realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it whispered. When Gabriel dropped her off at her new temporary home that evening, he hesitated before stepping back into the elevator. "I'll return tomorrow," he said quietly, his eyes lingering on hers a moment longer than expected. "There's still something you need to know." Elena nodded softly, her heart steady, not racing for the first time in a long time. She closed the apartment door behind her, leaning against it with a small, grateful smile. Something inside her felt whole, or at least whole enough to grow again. But as she stepped into the living room, she noticed something on the floor. A white envelope slipped gently through the door's mail slot, resting against the rug as though waiting patiently. Elena approached it slowly, her heartbeat rising with a familiar tension. The envelope had no markings, no name, no sender. Only her address, written in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She lifted it with careful fingers, her breath tightening as she turned it over. Whatever waited inside, she sensed, would change the meaning of everything Gabriel had just promised. Elena held the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Her breath, shallow as anticipation, curled gently inside her chest. The quiet of the apartment wrapped around her like a soft blanket, the snow outside catching the glow of street lamps in pale golden flecks. With careful fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside, bracing for the unknown. The handwriting was steady, elegant, deliberate, words written with intention, not haste, and as her eyes moved across the page, a warmth began to bloom within her. The letter was simple, almost modest, but its message carried the weight of a truth she had long forgotten she deserved. "Your kindness did not save me once," it read. "It continues to save me every day. People like you remind the world what it still can be." The signature at the bottom, Gabriel, felt like a gentle whisper rather than a declaration. Elena pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes closing, as gratitude washed over her in steady, quiet waves. Sometimes miracles didn't arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrived folded in paper. She sat by the window, watching snow drift softly along the glass, her thoughts drifting through all that had led her here, every long shift, every quiet tear, every moment she had chosen kindness, even when she had little to give. Life had stretched her thin, but it had not broken her. Instead, it had led her to a single night, a fragile act of compassion, and a stranger whose life had been unraveling in ways she never could have guessed. And in helping him, she had unknowingly opened the door for her own rescue. From the small table, she picked up her grandmother's scarf and pressed it gently to her cheek, savoring the familiar scent of lavender and winter. She imagined her grandmother's voice, warm and steady, reminding her that goodness returned in its own time, even if the journey to receive it felt impossibly long. Elena smiled softly, a tender ache blooming in her chest. Every hardship she had endured now felt like a step that had carried her towards something quietly extraordinary. Later that week, as she unlocked the diner, her diner now, she felt a fullness she hadn't known in years. Customers greeted her by name, their smiles genuine, their warmth unforced. She moved through the space with a grace shaped by every struggle she had endured, each table carrying the echo of her resilience. Where fear once lived, purpose now settled. Snowflake's Corner had always been a refuge for others. Now it was finally one for her too. Gabriel visited often, sometimes with business papers, sometimes with nothing more than a soft smile and a few minutes to share. He never tried to overshadow her role, never used his power to shape the diner into something it wasn't. Instead, he supported her quietly, encouraging her ideas, listening to her hopes, reminding her that her heart was the true center of the place. Their conversations grew gentle, steady, filled with a trust neither of them forced. Healing had found both of them, one kindness at a time. One evening, as Elena closed the register and watched fresh snow fall beyond the window, She realized how deeply her life had shifted, not because of wealth, not because of opportunity, but because compassion had echoed further than she ever expected. She thought of Gabriel's trembling hands that night, the way the world had pulled him toward darkness, and how a single bowl of soup had steadied him. She thought of her own nights of doubt, and how his gratitude had lifted her from the edge of despair. 2 lives, reshaped by one moment. She stepped outside and let the cold air kiss her skin, lifting her face toward the falling snow. The street shone with a soft, silver glow. The world wrapped in a kind of peace she hadn't felt since childhood. For the first time in a long while, she felt truly aligned with the life she was building, one step at a time, one act of kindness leading to another. Her heart felt full, not because everything was perfect, but because she finally felt seen, valued, and safe. As she locked the diner door, she whispered softly, "No one should freeze on Christmas." The words had once been a plea. Now they felt like a promise. One she had lived, one she intended to carry forward. Snowflake's Corner would be a place where warmth always found its way in, no matter how cold the world outside might become. And as she walked toward her new home, lights glowing gently in distant windows, she felt the truth settle in her chest. Kindness always circles back. Always. And so, with quiet steps on freshly fallen snow, Elena moved into the next chapter of her life, one shaped by grace, gratitude, and the gentle certainty that redemption blooms wherever compassion is planted. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and tap the screen to watch another story filled with kindness, hope, and redemption.